thanks to those of you here and for those of you on Zoom for joining us today for the Biology Department's Earth Day seminar. I really appreciate you making the time today. We are welcoming Dr. Christie Klimas, the Associate Professor of Environmental Science and Studies here at DePaul. And I would say, looking over her biography, that I'm very impressed with how well Dr. Klimas balances all the different aspects of science. So her work is already doing a lot of balance between the economics of sustainable resource use and conservation and the ecology of sustainable resource use and conservation. But in my interactions with her personally, I know she also balances the science with individual humans doing the science really well. She's done some amazing mentoring for women scientists at DePaul, and she's been very involved with the diversity, equity, and inclusion committees at DePaul, both at the department level and the college level. And she's been really instrumental in developing a mentoring program that the Department of Environmental Sciences has too for their majors. So I'm very, very impressed with your recognition of the importance of the human component, not only in your work in terms of involving local stakeholders and getting Indigenous communities involved in sustainable resource use and conservation efforts, but also your work supporting all the people that make up the community that is DePaul. Your story.
Excellent. And I will actually be talking about some of the students. So I'll actually highlight some student projects during my talk. And thank you so much. That was a beautiful introduction. And I was asked to highlight how I got to where I am. So it was sort of a story of a path to graduate school and DePaul. So I went to a college that no longer exists, but it focused on internships and co-ops. And so I spent about a quarter of my time not on campus. And sort of my first summer experience was working at Mount Desert Oceanarium in Maine, because I was a marine scientist at that point. And then I spent a semester at the Biosphere 2 Center in Arizona. If you've heard anything about the Biosphere 2 Center, it's that people were locked inside for 2 years, almost 2 years, to see if they could survive there as sort of a pilot program for survival on Mars. Didn't go well. Happy to talk about that later. I also spent a summer in Alaska watching the grass grow as part of the International Tundra Experiment, which was run by Michigan State University. I turned down an internship with dolphins to go to Alaska, which was interesting as a budding marine scientist. But really, I looked at plants grow, and I looked at how they were responding to elevated temperatures. So this was related to similar work that I would do in North Carolina at the Free Air Carbon Dioxide Enrichment Facility, where I was looking now at CO2 changes and how that affected forest plants. Then, after my undergraduate, I went back to the biosphere, and I worked there looking at the effects of temperature and carbon dioxide on plant growth in one of the microcosms. I left there when I got a fellowship to go to the Amazon, but I want to normalize how important failure and persistence is in science. So I was originally rejected for a Fulbright, and I was actually rejected for the first Rotary Fellowship that I applied for. So I got the second Rotary Fellowship that I applied for to go to the Amazon. And my path to the Amazon started when a colleague in Alaska was saying, oh, they have these like new field research stations for work in the Amazon, and they're horrible. There's bugs. There's, it's hot all the time. You have to wear boots up to your, pretty much up to your waist so that you don't get bit by snakes. And I was like, oh, and they're accepting interns because I would love to go. So that was my path to the Amazon. And then I loved it so much that I ended up going back to do my master's and doctorate with some faculty that I met there. I'm going to talk about some of that research, and mostly I focus on alternatives to deforestation from a coupled economic ecological perspective. But then I also have done some conservation work in Mexico in partnership with the Morton Arboretum and on the ground, the individuals who are doing the conservation. And this is going to be really a focus on some of the research that students have done that we're submitting for publication very soon. And then I'm going to sort of shift back to the big picture and talk about what we can do. So why our actions are important, which is also both economic and ecological. So we can see ecosystem shifts in a very short time. Within 45 years, this is the Atlantic coastal forest in Brazil. And the majority of this forest, which is green, was lost for a variety of different reasons. And now we have these forest remnants. So I work on trying to make the forest more valuable, intact, than it is cut down for other uses. And this normally involves trade-offs. It also involves strong partnerships with communities on the ground. When I started graduate school, there was a big debate, well, one of the many debates about whether we should do preservation first or whether we should try to alleviate poverty first. And there's great value in protected areas because people like funding them, and they provide large amounts of high quality habitat, but they tend to exclude those living in forests who tend to get to use the forest for survival. Because of their because of the fact that they ignore people, then they're often protected only on paper and they don't work. So I came around in a time when there was an attempt to find a middle ground between this. So if we focus on poverty alleviation first, we've been working on poverty alleviation for a long time and we haven't quite figured it out yet. So waiting could be problematic as well. But forest management tries to balance these two, where you try to avoid rapid development, where most of the time, in the short term, it makes the people living near forests better off, but then it makes them worse off in the longer term. And the benefits tend to flow to those who have invested, those who are most affluent already. So the question I've addressed in much of my research is how can we conserve natural resources and improve the quality of life for forest residents? And so that involves looking at some timber and non-timber harvest. Non-timber forest products are anything that's not timber. And they include things like Brazil nuts, which are those large protein-rich nuts that you get in holiday nut packages. Things like acai, which is all the rage now. So you guys have probably all heard of it. You've probably gone to some of the little storefronts that now sell you acai in very similar ways to that, where you can have it in South America, chocolate. And then in the chocolate family, we have cupuaçu, which is a sort of acidic fruit that it's an acquired taste, is all I can say. I really like it, but not everyone does. So what I try to do is, in partnership with communities, addressing first the needs of the communities relevant to conservation, is look at ecological sustainability and economic viability as my framework. And this involves lots of partners. I'll talk first about some of the work that I've done on a species called Andiroba, or Carapa guianensis. And this is what we call a multiple use species. And that just means that it's used for multiple things, one of which is timber, and another of which is the seed oil that comes from its seeds. It's a proven insect repellent. And then it's also used for a lot of homeopathic remedies that include everything from cancer treatments to a lot of unproven medicines. But it's also used industrially by some natural companies, and they make soaps and shampoos and a variety of other cosmetics from it. It's also used for timber. So this is an interesting species. So I looked at how much we can harvest, if any, sustainably, and then what the economic value of, of this species harvest is to forest residents. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the findings. To do this, first we needed to monitor some different populations. So each of these is a 500 by 500 meter site where trees were inventoried. And there are the ones on the left, your left, are occasionally inundated or periodically inundated forests. And the two panels on the right are upland dry forests. And so you can see there's a visible difference in the number of individuals. This was almost significant. And so we were interested, first in quantifying this. People said this species does not exist. It does not occur in upland dry forests. And we said, okay, well, that's something that we can test. And we went in and we said, well, there's a lot more trees than we thought there would be, and no significant difference. So that's good news in terms of management. We also wanted to understand seed production so that we could start to quantify how much revenue we could potentially expect if seed harvest was one of the predominant activities. And, just to make this more complicated, this is a masting species. So that means this species shows evidence of superproduction in certain years and very low production in other years. That's sort of what you least want if you're looking for a commercial species, because what you'd really like is more consistent revenue. So that does complicate this. This is actually sort of a period of seed production, and you can see the two different habitat types. So the terra firme, or red, is the upland dry forest, and the seasonally inundated forests are in yellow. And what you can see is those green bars are the rainy season. So production occurs during the rainy season. This is pretty typical for many, many Amazonian species. But there's differences, and these differences are actually only potentially significant during the rainy season. So when there's low production, everybody has low production. When there's higher production, then there's a difference between the forest types, with the wetter forests having higher seed production. We couldn't, in this site, with 4 to 5 years of data, we couldn't determine whether there were things like precipitation, other climatic variables that predicted what the next year's harvest was going to be. But I'll show you some research that looks at this on a much bigger scale. What we did find, and this is expected but good for management, is that intermediate-sized trees produce the majority of the seeds. Now, this is good for management because the largest trees are the ones that you want to harvest for timber. And so having high production at intermediate levels is really good if you're trying to create strategies that involve both timber harvest and seed collection. So then, and I want to really highlight that my work is almost always done in collaboration, and that makes it much, much stronger. So if I ever tell you like, oh, I did, this is my work and I did it alone, I would never say that. But I want you to understand like how much better collaborative research is. And this is something that I really, really appreciate about the work I do and the colleagues that I work with. So I actually was starting to write this up in collaboration with another site in Roraima. And one of my colleagues just called me up and she said, there's data on this in the floodplain forests in Amapá. You should talk to Ana Claudia. And so I, emailed Ana Claudia and I said, look, this is sort of out of the blue, but, we have a long-term data set of mass production on this species. And, would you be interested in collaborating? And her response was, yeah, sure, here's my data. So within 24 hours, I had another field site. And then we collaboratively looked at whether the climatic cues that are important in predicting whether or not species like this species super produce in any given year are consistent from one region of the Amazon to another. And what we found was they're not, at least for this species. So DBH, as expected, mattered. Bigger DBHs for 2 of the 3 sites indicated that there was more production with larger trees. The Amapá site was an outlier, probably because it was a floodplain forest. So in order to collect the data, they put nets or fences all the way around the trees. And so they only chose larger trees. So we just don't have probably the range of sizes to really look at this in the same way that we do in the other sites. And we found differences probably based on the microclimates or the habitats, as we call these regions, were important in determining whether or not the individuals produced or not. Either they massed it or they didn't. And then the quantity of seeds that were produced by an individual tree. And so we found in drier areas, more rain was more correlated with seed production. And in already wet areas, we saw the inverse. And our ACRE data included both sites. So, we had these, seasonally inundated and upland dry forests. And so that was a bit of a conundrum, and we're considering separating out this data and trying to look at it based on local precipitation measures. So that's a lot of ecological data, and much of that then went in our models to look at whether or not we could have ecologically sustainable seed projection. We use 2 methods to do this. So the first, we use matrix population models. And matrix population models are matrices that show these relationships where you have seeds. Some of those seeds grow and become seedlings. Some of those, and in this species, no seeds stay seeds. We don't have a seed bank. Some of the seedlings stay seedlings for a while. So they can stay seedlings or they can move to saplings. They can stay saplings or they can move to juveniles. At any point, they can die, right? So there's mortality possible in any of these categories. And then for adults, they can stay adults, they can die, or they can, they can stay adults or they can die. They don't have any other options. Adults and sometimes juveniles can reproduce seeds. So this is our model, and we have a matrix that represents this and then projects the population out in the future based on this. Does that more or less make sense? Okay. Now, that's our first model. The second model is what we call an integral projection model. It's a variation of this. But here, since we have these discrete categories, if, just based on probability, a sapling more quickly than actually occurs moves into the juvenile stage, and then more quickly than actually occurs moves in the adult stage in our model, then we can actually see higher than expected increases in population growth and reproduction. Integral projection models, they correct for that by making lots and lots and lots and lots of intermediate categories. So in essence, all they do is they take these 5 circles and they make hundreds of circles. And this corrects for these potentially rapid transitions that are not biologically feasible. So what did we find? Well, with some of the matrix population models, we found that in these, with 5 years of data, we saw the potential for sustainable harvest. Lambda is if lambda is above 1, it means your population is growing. If lambda is 1, it means your population is stable. And if lambda is below 1, it means that your population is declining. So it's what we call the intrinsic population growth rate. It's also a special characteristic of the matrix. So when we look at this, we see like, okay, well, these values, you know, there's one that's above one, but if we look at our confidence intervals, well, that one, that's no good, but on the top one, we go from 0.98 to 1.06. So there's a sustainable, you know, that population is potentially increasing. When we looked at our integral projection models, we actually saw pretty similar results to our lower confidence interval for the matrix model, except in one of our upland dry forests that was hit by a forest fire. And there, we actually saw that the model, the integral projection model, showed much lower population viability in the fire affected forest than we saw in our matrix model. So this is interesting from a model comparison standpoint. It's also a little disappointing. We were really excited when we were able to publish the matrix population models and say, you know, we see sustainable harvest, most people don't, but you know, this is what our data is showing. And when we looked at the integral projection models, what we were seeing was, you know, these previously sustainable harvest levels from our original models were no longer sustainable. That said, what's interesting is that they were economically viable. So they remained economically viable. Nobody's making millions by managing the rainforest. But this, coupled with other strategies, is potentially a viable strategy for forest management. We can talk about payment for forest services and things like that as well. But, you know, in essence, per hectare, we're getting, you know, $57, $18 for seed oil, and then more when we start incorporating some of the revenue from timber. So this is interesting, and it's not as bad as it might seem. So I think I presented these results and I said, like, this is really hopeful. And somebody said, how can it be unsustainable and hopeful? And I said, well, there's things we can do to increase the presence of Carapa guianensis in the forest. We can do tree planting, we can cut vines, we can do a lot of things to make sure that this species has an increased probability of survival in some of these older size classes or larger size classes. And also we can plant more, right? So this is not an insurmountable obstacle. Clearly, it was nice when we thought it was a system that would sort of self-manage. But I think there's much that can be done. Now, I sort of want to switch gears to similar work, but this is, you know, this is work where I've mentored students doing some of, you know, to answer some similar questions in the Baja California Sur Peninsula in Mexico. So this is actually work that was done by Carolyn Brinkworth. And this is a partnership with the Morton Arboretum and Dr. Sylvia Alvarez-Clare. So here, we're looking not in the Amazon, but in the desert regions of Mexico. And it's really neat. This is also a masting species. It's concentrated in these arroyos, and we're looking at the distribution. So here we measured trees from all throughout the Baja California Peninsula, and we looked at DBH, and then we did some similar analyses of the spatial distribution. One of these was Ripley's K analysis, where we looked at the relative, sort of the distance of one tree to another. It's calculating its nearest neighbor. So first what we do is we take tree one, and we look at the distance between tree one and tree two. Then we take tree one, we look at the distance between that tree and tree three. We look at the distance between tree one and tree four. And then we do the same thing starting with tree two, and we get the nearest, you know, we get the distance to all the nearest neighbors of these individual trees. So Carolyn did this, and then we do it with tree three. And we found what we expected, which is that this species is highly aggregated alongside these ephemeral riverbeds. And we actually also found that we may have mapped most of the population of this species. Now that is both good and bad. This is just a histogram of the nearest neighbor distances with the frequency diagrams. So the majority of trees really like each other, right? They're 0 to 20 meters apart. In fact, one of the questions that we're now looking at is whether they're not just nearest neighbors, but whether they're genetically the same individuals. And this is something that we're very interested in finding out. As part of this larger project, so Carolyn mapped the nearest neighbor distances and the spatial distribution of the species, but Maddie Fernandez worked on another project where we were looking at why this species has no regeneration. Not just no regeneration, but we have no adult trees, under an estimated age of 100. So this is a critically endangered species. It's on the red list. So we used a 2015 survey of the population and some ongoing experiments. So what's interesting about this species is when we talk about protected areas, the entire distribution of the population is in the Sierra La Laguna Biosphere Reserve. So it is a protected location, but it's protected in a way that still has challenges for species regeneration. So this allows for this area has sort of ejidos, and those ejidos include small scale ranching. And it's like free range ranching. It's like everything you want if you're going to eat meat. These are happy animals. They hang out all along the riverbeds and they eat the seedlings of Quercus Brandegeei, we think. So we wanted to be able to quantify the effects of farm animals on regeneration. So Maddie worked with some data from an experiment where we put in enclosures. And so here you can see the red boxes are enclosures where we planted seedlings. And then outside those enclosures, we also planted seedlings. And then we measured more or less monthly, although this was affected by COVID, mortality and survival of all those planted and marked seedlings. And we looked at whether they had evidence of herbivory, trampling, new growth, and drying. Some of these areas were in the shade of a mother tree, and some of these were not. So we were also looking at some light effects, but I'm not going to talk about that. Now, this is not going to be a huge surprise to anyone. The enclosures were highly effective at reducing short-term mortality of the seedlings. Intriguingly, grazing did not immediately kill the seedlings, so there's actually opportunities to put in enclosures after seedlings have established. So this is good for conservation knowledge. Now, what are we doing next? Well, we also installed camera traps in this area. And so we're interested in looking at which species spent the most time in these plots so that we can look at who the main seed predators are. So right now we have cows, we have goats, we have pigs, and then we have a lot of the native wildlife in this area. Now, why does it matter? Well, because cows push over fences, pigs burrow under fences, and goats jump over fences. So knowing how to best support regeneration of this species, particularly since we're seeing zero regeneration, is something that's of real conservation interest to us. In fact, the only places where we're seeing regeneration are in people's home gardens that are fenced. And then another step that we're working with Daniel, who's a master's student, well, just recently finished his master's. He's working on the ground, is we're trying to quantify seed production so we can try to determine, similar to the study in the Amazon, how much of the seed production is necessary to encourage future regeneration of the species and how much can be used for livestock and human consumption. The acorn flour is ground up and made into like a pudding, a milk pudding called atole. is just a pause. But I want to thank everyone who, all the funders and the team who has helped with this. And I've had 5 DePaul students to date work on components of this project, which is really great. 4 of them worked on this completely remotely through the pandemic. So this has been really a wonderful way to give back. And then I want to connect this back to us. So what we do matters for conservation. I've sort of given you 2 examples where it seems like the impacts, the threats to the species that we're working on are not directly related to us. And yet some of the bigger threats are. So one of my last lines of research is I look at the impact of stuff. So I take things apart. If you've heard about like decapitated Barbies and things like that, also my research. And then I convert the materials that go into different products into their impacts. And I've done this with a variety of students. These are, this is a paper that we published comparing different kinds of entertainment, DVDs and books. But then I had another student look at the impact of jewelry and publish in DePaul Discoveries. We just had an article come out on toys. So if you look at the primary drivers of forest loss worldwide, you can see it varies. Forestry, the green, is important in North America. And yet commodity-driven deforestation is 64 plus or minus 8% of the causes behind deforestation in South America. So when we look at that, what do we mean by commodity-driven deforestation? It can mean a lot of different things, but one of the growing causes of deforestation is responsible for more than 10% of deforestation right now in the Amazon is gold mining. Where does the gold mining go? Some of it goes into finance or investments. Some of it goes into our pockets for electronics. That's actually a relatively small part. And part it goes into jewelry. So these are all causes. This is what the deforestation from mining looks like. And mining is particularly problematic because you have to do a couple things. So first you have to remove the trees because the soil is where the gold is. So you have these alluvial flakes of gold that have washed down from the mountains. And to get at them, you actually have to take the soil, put it on a slide, covered with a carpet, and then wash that water and soil down the slide. The gold flakes get stuck in the carpet. And then you take that carpet off your slide and you put it in a big, barrel of water. And then you get gold flakes in water. But what you'd really like is for your gold flakes to be a nugget. That's ideal. And to do that, you want to amalgamate it. So you add some mercury. And you add the mercury and then you get a gold and mercury nugget. Now you'd really like to not have mercury in your nugget. So what you do is that you just burn that off. Now the problem with that is that by burning, that mercury becomes far more bioavailable, goes directly to your brain, and it's a neurotoxin. Even though it's around for something like less than a minute, it's really devastating for the people who are mining. Some miners are small families. And so when we look at who's mining, we have about 6,000 miners in the buffer zone, but claims of between 30 and 40,000 illegal miners in the Madre de Dios area, which is the area of Peru that borders Brazil and Bolivia. So this is an environmental catastrophe, but it's more than that. This is a human catastrophe because there are very few alternatives. So when you have people exposing themselves to mercury in an attempt to earn more than they can do in any other activity, this is a true failure in terms of lack of options in these areas. Now, Peru has tried various things. They've come in and shot people. That doesn't help. They've destroyed mining equipment. It's just temporary, it comes back. And so really, one of the ways that this is going to have to shift is going to have to be a shift in demand, or really more transparency in work on global goals. This is something that we don't hear about very much. And so, but it's really important because it connects back to us. So all of this demand is international. And even though not all of it is due to us, bringing attention to this issue and pushing for transparency in gold supply chains is going to be important in terms of sort of the push for alternatives in this region. So this is just a picture. This is a biosphere reserve, La Pampa. So you may have heard of Manu National Park. It's one of the most biodiverse regions in the world. The Tambopata National Reserve is another extremely biodiverse region. And what we're seeing here is encroachment on the buffer zone of the reserve from mining. And one of the challenges that many NGOs are successfully, in some cases, achieving is that they're trying to get people to do forest management, which is sort of what we started the talk with, where we're trying to plant cacao and other species that provide longer term revenue, even though it's not as short-term valuable as the mining that's going on. Okay. This is just sort of where the gold goes. It shifted. It used to be more jewelry, but jewelry is still a key component. Investment has become more of the impact because gold is a safe investment. And so, technology still, and I couldn't quite find a more recent graphic, but technology is still a relatively small part of the demand for gold. So what can we do? Well, pushing for increased transparency in global supply chains of gold is really important. And then, trying to support work on alternatives. I wrote an op-ed about some of the great work that different organizations on the ground are doing that we have no idea about, and how we can better highlight that work and support it in different ways. One of these organizations is Cincia, and they do work monitoring the forest. They actually work with miners to try to recover some of these formerly mined areas. They have nursery programs. They work with biochar as a fertilizer to help regrow the rainforest in some of these formerly mined areas. They do a lot of community outreach, particularly about the harms of mercury, to try to switch away. There's actually better ways to create gold nuggets than mercury, and so they're doing some work on that as well. There's also, the jewelry industry was one of the first industries to, start trying to move in a better direction. And so they have done some work on responsible production and consumption. They have some, small scale gold production that's happening in various parts of the Amazon that's far more sustainable than what, than the example I showed you. The Field Museum, in collaboration with Amazon Aid, has also created some resources for education. There's the Clean Gold Buyer's Guide. There's certifications like Fair Mined Gold that help determine whether or not your gold contributed to some of these problems. The best thing about gold is it's 100% recyclable. So that's an easy option. And so some of the work on different aspects of addressing this problem is really exciting. Conservation X Labs doing an artisanal mining challenge as well that's trying to address some of this. So just because it's Earth Day, I want to sort of end with the fact that the environment is probably why I got into my research field, but environmental degradation is almost never an isolated problem. It's almost always linked with all the social justice issues that we care about and want to address. And so I think it's really important when we talk about environmental issues to talk about their links with people. And then I just want to thank this probably doesn't even capture all the people that I should thank, even though I've had 2 thank you slides.
Thank you very much.
Do you guys have any questions?
And if anyone on Zoom has questions, you can feel free to either unmute or you can type in the chat and I can forward a question on.
I have a question about the trees that they were looking at, like the covering. Has there been any more recent data as to are they surviving now that's been a few years or like anything on that? Like, is there a reason besides, is there another explanation yet that that they're dying even if they were raised in an enclosure?
So we only have 1 year of data on the enclosure raised seedlings. And unfortunately, even the majority in the enclosures died because we stopped watering them. We never watered them. So by the end of the dry season, the vast majority were also dead. Those that were under forest canopies tended to do a little better, but it's quite possible, and this is what we're writing in our discussion, that it won't just be enclosures, but in order to encourage regeneration, it'll probably be necessary to actively garden in order to increase the regeneration. And some of it is, if you have the species that have lasted for, we tried to do carbon dating, we haven't done carbon dating yet, but we've tried to look at growth rings, and it gets stuck in the tree, like we can't get it out 3 times. So we don't even know how old the trees are, honestly. And so it's one of those things where with long-lived species like Quercus, we probably have time, right, to address recruitment failure. But at the same time, since there's now so many new pressures that aren't part of its, that it didn't evolve under, then we're probably also in a race against time in many ways. But we do have some individuals who are between 10 and 20 years old, and they're all in home gardens. So the communities have been working. They have viveros or nurseries for the trees, and they're ready to plant. So we actually have, I think, almost 1,000 seedlings that are ready to plant. And we're distributing that. They're being distributed within communities with money from the Franklinia Foundation. And I think Sylvia Alvarez-Claire just received another grant from the Franklinia Foundation that will help move this initiative forward. But some of it is just trying to determine what will best allow for regeneration of this species, because it's going to take so long to reestablish populations if that's the goal.
That's really interesting.
Good question from Windsor
Mhm.
line.
Yeah, hopefully you can hear me. Thanks for the presentation. It's very interesting. And I had a couple comments. One is, kind of the issue of reserves and that in which that the resources are being used sustainably versus reserves where they're kind of people reserves.
Mhm.
And that seems like a complicated issue. I think the sympathy tends to go towards trying to make sure that the people can use the resources in the area, and I understand that completely. But then on the other hand, if you actually go to these areas where there are people that are living, and using the resources of the land in a historical way, just people are extraordinarily good at hunting and changing the ecosystem. And so, even in those contexts, it seems like, I don't know if you have some opinion about what happens in those areas to the large fierce predators that tend to be important for regulating ecosystem function.
Yeah, no, go ahead.
Well, and that's just a comment. So I tend to sympathize with making sure, like you said, a lot of this becomes abstract about, and you see this with in classes. It's very abstract, and we should preserve the environment. We should help these species that are in danger, and then you go to the area and you meet with people and you interact with them, and then it gets a lot more complicated. So that's just a comment I don't have a great answer for, but it is, if you visited these areas and I mean, I assume people are just so good at taking animals out.
Yeah, and I mean, John Terborg has done a lot of work, on what we call the empty forest, right, where you've removed many of the larger seed dispersers, and so then you're shifting the composition of the forest, even if you're shifting it on a longer time frame. And I would say that when I first started, I don't want to say this the wrong way, but I probably didn't care as much about people, and it's hard because as you meet more and sort of as you put together, and Peru is an interesting case, right? Because you have this internal conflict with the Shining Path, and people were disappeared and murdered and things like that. And many fled to the cities, but people fled to different parts of Peru as well. And so when you sort of look at all these factors, it's really hard to look at what's happening sort of in isolation, and particularly like in isolation of global demand. So I feel like in many cases we like sort of push, we sort of look at people's interactions in some of these managed forests in the absence of global demand, and yet the global demand is funding a lot of this forest destruction. So, but yeah, in the Sierra La Laguna in Baja California Sur, we have relatively small sort of sustainable systems that are pushing the arroyo oak to extinction because you just have livestock grazing. And so I mean, E.O. Wilson sort of talked about, more on the preservation side. And I would love to see that. I just feel like we're on a very full earth. And so I have a hard time, I think, just mentally reconciling what would happen on this very full earth. And yet at the same time, we're watching species go extinct at really high rates, and managed forests are not nearly as effective as preservation areas or, indigenous reserves where there's very little commodity production. So I guess I'm on the fence.
Yeah, and well, I think it seems complicated. I'm with you. It seems there's a lot of people. I joke with the students that I often feel like Thanos. That's not the spirit of my comment, but there are a lot of people on Earth, and makes things very difficult. But the other point I had is just a comment, and I wonder, kind of in your conversations, many South American countries had policies that were designed to encourage the use of land, and often these came from theoretically good place. So in Ecuador, we had policies that basically would take away land that wasn't being used productively, so that wasn't used in agriculture or for some activity. And the idea was that there were very wealthy people that had very large tracts of land that they weren't using, and then there were lots of people that didn't have that land. So the idea was, okay, let's take some of this unproductive land and give it to people. But the product was that the forest was cut because you had to use it or you're going to lose it. And so it encouraged deforestation. And I wonder, like in your conversations with people, I wonder how much of a movement there is to do the opposite, to actually pay people for preserving forest. And also, that's one part of it, and because forest provides very valuable ecosystem services, and very healthy forest is becoming harder to come by. So it seems like it's going to become valuable in the future to have that. And so I wonder how if there's a way to implement that. And then the other thing is to create conscious. I mean, we talk about these things that are in these, for a United States perspective, very remote areas. But the reality is that the people that are taking the natural resources like the chocolate, they're not paid for the work they really do, right? The people that are the people that do the hard work of extracting many of these resources, they're not paid. They're paid very small amounts, so that's the best they can do. But kind of, I know wealth can be a relative concept. So people think I'm poor because you're comparing yourself to your peers, and maybe you don't have as much as the people here. But in the United States, generally, the economy is pretty, it's pretty well off, and so the reality is most people can pay for more for things, but we just don't because we don't want to, because we want to have more money for ourselves. But we can't afford to pay more, and probably we could afford to pay, at least portions of the population could pay more for the products that are coming from South America. So anyway, I don't, how do you actually translate that to making more people conscious of the fact that we're not really paying for a lot of the products that we use. We're paying much less than the people that are doing the work deserve to get.
Yeah, no, it's a really good point. And I think some of fair trade and, related to Fair Mine certification are attempts to bring this to light. And one of the reasons that I like focusing on gold is because it's a luxury good. So everyone who purchases gold can pay more for it because it is not necessary. And so there are some things where you say this is necessary for survival. So paying more for water or paying more for food products or things like that. I think there's a valid counter argument in some cases that you have to make trade-offs, but with jewelry production, that's very rarely the case because you're working with a luxury good. Same thing with investment and technology like cell phones. These are things that are already luxuries, particularly in some of the countries that are driving the demand for this. And so encouraging purchase only of jewelry with recycled gold, Brilliant Earth is one of the suppliers, is totally doable. And so that's part of the reason that I ended with this, because I do think that we have a role that's oftentimes unacknowledged. And the number of times that I'll talk with someone about gold in the Amazon, be like, have you heard about this? And I mean, 95% of the time people say, no, I had no idea this was going on. So I think that bringing attention to this, that said, I've worked more in fair trade for longer, and bringing attention is not enough. It doesn't, it's, fair trade is just 0.01% of the global trade market. So I don't know how to go from bringing attention to causing a shift without some of the things like legislation. Both Peru and Brazil suffer from some of the legislation that you're talking about, where you can squat on land and then that land becomes yours because it's not used. In fact, Brazil actively encouraged people to go settle in the Amazon so that they could take it away from Bolivia. And then, they still celebrate that. So like in these areas that exist only because Brazil told people to go settle there, both Bolivia and Brazil have this celebration. It's very counterproductive. Right now in Brazil, I can't see any of that changing because Bolsonaro, this is not his, it's the antithesis of how he thinks. So I think you'd have to have a political shift for some of this legislation to change in Brazil. In Peru, the president has a Congress that was established by a former party and is sort of embattled just to stay in office. It's probably also, what I've heard from Peruvians is not a great president, but is better than the alternative. And so I guess I'm not holding out great hope in either country. Bolivia has done better in this respect. And I think that there are things, so Peru has done, they've set aside over 6,000 or 60,000 hectares of land. I have to look at the final number, and they're paying, people can go in and harvest Brazil nuts, but they cannot do anything else. So they have sort of like this temporary tenure. to harvest Brazil nuts, but these are otherwise completely protected areas. So they're, you know, they are doing, there's some novel solutions. So paying people to conserve the forest is good. There's sort of this is, you know, I think it's good overall. There's like the complicated issue of who gets paid. So do you pay indigenous people if they're not a threat? You should, but sometimes we end up paying the people who are the most threat because they're most likely to deforest. So sometimes there's equity issues in paying for the forest that the global community is still resolving. And then you have Brazil. So worked in Brazil for a long time, and they just said, like, we don't want the PPG7 money anymore. We would like, you know, we don't care if you're paying us to save our forest, we're not going to do it. So like the political piece is so important, I guess. And I feel like right now, I'm maybe a little frustrated with the politics, particularly in Brazil, which is a country I love very deeply. So I don't know if that.
Yeah, they're more like comments. I don't think, yeah, it's hard to, we could resolve it probably. We would have done it already.
We should have coffee, Windsor.
Yeah, as you answered the question I was going to ask too, is, and I see that you work with a number of different NGOs and they seem to be advocating for and actuating a lot of good, but how often does the government not only not support their work, but actually actively get in the way of that work? And it sounds like that is, there is a bit of an antagonism there.
Yeah, and I would say like less so in Peru right now, although in Peru, the complaint is more that as they've developed, they've become less of a priority country for international funders. And so some of the funding that they were receiving has gone away because it's being earmarked for countries where there's even greater threats and fewer government resources. With Brazil, they've actually actively rejected funding and they've told NGOs that they can't take funds from international organizations. So Brazil is actively like putting roadblock after roadblock after roadblock in front of their NGOs, which is unfortunate because, I mean, I've worked in Brazil longer than I've worked in Peru. And the great work of the NGOs, I mean, they've done so much good, and it was really great being able to talk about all the good they had done and their efficacy in monitoring deforestation. And, you know, some of the you know, drone and satellite monitoring had really, Brazil had been a best practice country in terms of doing some of this. The NGOs had really strong reputations and outreach and partnerships throughout the Amazon with those living there. And there had been so much progress. And then it took such a short time to really stop that. And so I think, so maybe it's like a moment, you know, this is a moment in time where things are very frustrating, but for me personally, but I feel like it's hard because I've watched decades of buildup of conservation. And then sort of, it's so easy to stall or reverse that work. But that's not very hopeful. So I can't end with that. But I do think, and this is something that I think we don't do, is it's so easy to say like this is all an individual responsibility, but I do think it's really important to acknowledge some of the great work that's happening in these areas that's led by those who are from these areas and just have a wealth of knowledge, and sometimes are implementing solutions or sometimes developing partnerships to implement some of those solutions. So I really think that this is an exciting, you know, that there's so much good work going on in conservation, and I don't want to focus on the the challenges and ignore the fact that there are so many people working toward different solutions.
Yeah, I mean, you give a great example of that with your data set where you reached out to someone you've never met before and said, hey, I have this data set, I hear you're working on something similar, and you had it like that. And I think that's potentially a space for optimism. It's like within the scientific community itself. I think there's a real appreciation for the value of collaboration, the value of sharing, the value of working together towards a common cause. And I think that can transcend some of those other obstacles in a lot of ways.
I think that's a really good point. And it was one of the things I still find most rewarding about being in the conservation field is that it truly is a collaborative and supportive community where people are working together. And I was in a different field for a while in ecology, and it felt like a constant competition, and conservation doesn't feel that way. It's shared frustration sometimes.
Thank you very much, and thank you all again for coming. And I will be posting a recording of this on the biology seminar page as well. So if you have any friends, students, colleagues that weren't able to attend today, so that will be available soon.
Perfect. We'll send it out in our newsletter.
Thank you, Dr. Klimas.